our
trauma. The majority of the patients, maybe not the majority, but so many of the patients that we've talked about, Native American background, and how, I know for me, I mean, look at me, I'm a skinny white chick from middle class. I don't have a lot of that, I don't know how to say this, but I don't have a lot of that experience of, you know, living on a reservation or living in an environment that is traumatizing just by being in the environment. And I think sometimes we forget that. We forget that some of our folks come from, just by virtue of being Native American, they may come from a very traumatizing background, even if they didn't necessarily experience it firsthand. Their parents or their grandparents did, and that has become sort of part of their culture in some ways, that there's that reverberating trauma throughout the generations. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So go ahead and hit the next slide, Sarah. One of the things that really pops up when we talk about Native American history and some of that trauma is the Trail of Tears comes up, and some of the folks here in Montana definitely came from the Trail of Tears. So stuff that I love history, it's fascinating. But in 1831, the Indian Removal Act actually allowed the federal government to trade, and that was what they called it, trade, Western land for the Southern and very valuable native held land. A lot of our Native Americans that are here in our region actually originated from the South. And so the United States of America, or, you know, they said, we're going to trade this land for you. And even though the act did not allow for forcible removal and actually said that it should be peaceful, that was never followed and it was never enforced. So, you know, it's an example of, and, you know, we can see some of that in our current day situation where, you know, even though something is said to be peaceful or not forced, it's not regulated, it's not followed through with. So sometimes these people, whole families were marched, sometimes at gunpoint, to Oklahoma, to other lands. There was a lot of disease going through it, typhus, whooping cough. Whole families would end up getting wiped out. During that time, 4,000 simply died from hunger. They were on this march, so to speak. And when we talk about just one of the tribes, the Choctaw, there were 16,000 of them were forced to move, and 6,000 died. So just looking at that, it was a huge chunk of people. This was families, and if I think about my own family, you know, if there was, you know, a third of them that just died, that were gone, and how that might affect me in my current relationships and my current existence, and how that might affect our patients now today. I'm going to hit the next slide. So the relocation policy then, this was, you know, a good 107 years later, 1950s and 1960s, which really wasn't very long ago. And it moved the Native American families to urban areas. And so the idea was to get them off of these rural reservation lands with the promise of jobs, housing, and how that really affected them. And you found then, and I know I can see it here in Billings, there's little pockets, so to speak, of Native American culture, of family units that still stay together. But they were moved out of their traditional rural areas into these urban areas. The Little Shell tribe in particular is one of the tribes here in Montana, and it was federally recognized, or not federally recognized, and so therefore has no land. And for a lot of the Native Americans, you know, land is everything. Land connects them to their spiritual beliefs, their culture, and so to have a tribe in itself that literally is not recognized by the federal government and then has no land, which is essentially saying we have nothing for you, and how that might affect historically. You know, we talk about, oh yeah, I came from Germany or I came from wherever. What if that was just gone? That didn't exist? How would that affect your feeling of connection to your family and your feeling of connection to the world around you? Pine Ridge, South Dakota is actually one of the poorest zip codes in the United States, and it's a reservation. So not only when we, and I say we, the United States, moved Native Americans from their native lands, but then moved them again into these urban areas, we also then took away a lot of not only their culture, but a lot of their economic source. You know, Native American tribes didn't necessarily have money. They used bartering, they used trade, they used things like that. And so we took not only their culture and their land, but we took their currency, for lack of a better term. We took that away from them. And so that's one of the reasons that a lot of the Native American tribes nowadays, they have this very poor economy. And you think about that ripple effect when we talk about what are some of the adverse experiences that people may experience. Being socio-economically repressed is a significant trauma. It's a significant adverse experience. And then go ahead and hit the next slide. I was talking with one of my former coworkers who is Crow, and he was talking to me about when I was trying to put this kind of presentation together, and he was talking about how some of his family, how this had affected them, and how so many of people, and his elders, that their culture, their situation in life was so affected by this idea that you kill the Indian but you save the child. So essentially saying that you can make a Native American not Native American. You can make them white, so to speak, making them assimilate. And so again, it was a significant loss of culture. Children were actually punished for speaking their own language, for trying to practice the rituals that they had grown up in. Part of that came from like boarding schools. Native American children were pulled from their families and put in these boarding schools, and how traumatizing that would be for any child. And then the family, how that affected them. You lose this whole generation of children. And of course, when white people began to, I guess, infiltrate, for lack of a better word, there was a lot of infectious diseases that Native Americans did not have immunity to. And so a lot of them died just by the virtue of interacting with some of these white people that were taking over. Lots of physical and sexual abuse because they were not considered to be human. They were considered to just be these things. And so this was really, really traumatizing for, like I said, my coworker. He was even talking about how some of that has really affected him and his immediate family. And so when we think about this trauma, just by being Native American, there's a level of trauma there that we don't always necessarily recognize. And then another layer too is how you talk about their culture. So a lot of Native Americans have a mix of Christianity and Native spiritual practices. And I know when I first moved to Billings, talking with my coworkers and learning about the tribes that are local, and how it was very difficult for me at first to be like, well, okay, so what do they believe? Because they all believe different things. There's a mix. Just because someone is, say, Crow doesn't mean that they have solely Crow spiritual beliefs. They may have some of the Crow beliefs plus some Christianity, and any mix or variation of it. And so it's really important that when we talk to anybody, but for this purpose, Native Americans, asking them, what do they believe? Do they believe in the Christian God? Do they have spiritual beliefs that are more culturally native? What do they believe? Because one of the things I have found is that is a true sense of strength for them when they can really think about their own Native American history and culture. What is their spiritual practice and belief, and how can they find strength from that? There's a lot of resilience in there. There's a lot of trauma and a lot of resilience. And I think sometimes we neglect to really, at least I know in the past, sometimes I have neglected to fully take that into account when working with patients. Go ahead and hit the next slide. So some of the historical trauma, again, this is from the 1950s and 60s, along with that moving from land that they had already been moved to. They were relocated again to the urban areas. There was also a termination policy. And so the government, they ended a lot of the relationships with over 100 tribes. And so whereas the United States government had said, yes, you are a recognized tribe, we recognize your people, we recognize your culture, they just decided, oh, nevermore, we're not doing that. And so then that created a loss of federal support, land, tribal identity. Tribes could reapply for that status in the 80s and 90s, and some were able to do so and some were not. So when we look at just the history on the face of it, there's a lot of times where, this culture has completely been disregarded and cut off, and how that affects them. And it's going to be different for each person, but I think, again, I don't know about other people, but I was not taught this when I was in school. When I was in elementary school, we learned about elementary history in like elementary school and even middle school. They talked about some of the Native American culture, but really not emphasizing it as much as I think it needs to be. And so some of this is kind of a surprise for us when we're like, oh, I didn't know it was that significant. And I think, again, we overlook that. And so I think it's important for us all to have that at the forefront, and how it affects them. And like I said at the beginning, I'm a blonde white person, and, I don't know how that would feel, that level of repression, that level of trauma, just by being who you are, and how that may affect them. I keep saying that. Go ahead and hit the next slide, Sarah. So 1950s through the 1970s, thousands of Native American children were actually adopted out to white families. And now we have, if there's a child abuse or neglect on the reservation, or even not on the reservation, if it's a Native American child, you want to make sure that you do whatever you can to make sure they stay with their culture, to stay with their family, if at all possible. Because for a period of time, for about 20 years, we just said, oh, any family can take you. And so then there was another loss of that family, another disconnection, where people were essentially just cut off from their culture and their roots. A lot of the Native Americans were not actually given citizenship until the 1920s. So even though, late 1800s is when we really started, cutting them off from their land, moving them, severing their cultural connections, we didn't actually give them another, I don't want to say another culture, because that doesn't make sense, but we didn't even give them citizenship. We took away what they had and didn't give them anything else. We didn't give them any other rights until the 1920s. And to me, that's shocking. That's kind of when I hear about, things like women getting the right to vote. I'm like, wow, that was really actually relatively recent that happened. And so there's another layer of that trauma in there. And until the Indian Religious Freedom Act in 1987, many Native American practices were actually considered illegal. So all of these ways that white man really repressed the Native American culture in a way to control it. And when we look at today what's happening in our society, we can look at Charlottesville, we can look at some of the other more current news events, and we can see that same pattern happening where groups of people are being repressed or discriminated against or hurt simply by who they are. Okay, go ahead and hit the next slide. So the local tribes, and again, like I said, when I moved to Billings about 12 years ago now, I grew up mostly in Missoula, so I was more familiar with the Blackfeet tribe. And so local tribes here in the Billings area, Crow, they were actually scouts for the U.S. Army, which I thought was very interesting. Even though they didn't get citizenship, we didn't give them a lot of the rights. And even now, we still don't give Native American people some of the rights and dignity that they should have. But they participated in our armed services. They were actually scouts for the U.S. Army, which, here's a group of people that really stepped in and tried to be a part of our cause. And I don't know that we necessarily did that for them. The Crows originally come from Minnesota. Cheyenne originally came from Oklahoma, and they came to Montana on the Trail of Tears, originally from Florida, Alabama, other southern states. So you look at the Cheyenne in particular, and they've been relocated twice, not just once, twice. And the Sioux and Cheyenne are historically allies. Lame Deer is the name of a Sioux chief. So when we talk about some of these, I know I was talking with a brand new baby counselor, and she just kind of had all Native Americans lumped into one. And I said, well, they're actually very different. There's similarities, but they're different groups, different cultures, different practices. And again, that's something you have to ask. You have to ask, what are your beliefs? And this intern that I was working with, she really didn't understand that there were different tribes with different beliefs, different histories. And then history, Sioux and Cheyenne, historically, they were allies. They were a team together, and how we have affected that relationship. And go ahead and hit the next one. This is kind of just a layout of where they are for here in Billings. So the Crow tribe, where are you from, is often answered with a family or tribal name, not necessarily a location. So when we say, where are you from? We always think, oh, I'm from Missoula, I'm from Oregon, I'm from wherever. And for the Crow tribe, they often connect it with their family. Where are they from is from their family, not necessarily a physical geographic location. And that can give you a clue to what their cultural beliefs are. The Crow tribe is about 13,000 individuals, and 10,000 live on the reservation. And so taking that into account, there's a relatively small proportion that do not actually reside on the reservation. And they're not taught moderation. So when we talk about alcohol use or substance use, it tends to be, at least for the Crow tribe, it's either all or nothing. It's black and white. And they're not necessarily taught, you have one or two beers or a little bit of this or a little bit of that. And so that's something to take into account with the Crow tribe. And the next slide. Next week, we're actually going to talk a little bit more about the Northern Cheyenne. And we're going to talk more about how do we have that multicultural competence. When I talk to people here at Rimrock, when we talk about how do we have multicultural competence, I tell them I have a love-hate relationship with multicultural competence, because on one hand it says, based on the color of your skin, I'm going to assume that you are Crow or that you are Hispanic or that you are whatever, and therefore your beliefs mean X, Y, and Z, when really that may not be the case. I don't like the idea that multicultural competency teaches that based on the color of your skin, there's going to be a minority status or repression or whatever connected with it, because we honestly don't know. We have to ask each individual, what is your belief? Whether you're white, whether you're whatever it is, what are your beliefs? What is your perspective? How does your culture, your family, your history, how does that affect who you are right now? And so we'll talk a lot more about that next week, because I think that even though when we talk about licensure or being a counselor, you're supposed to take these multicultural competency classes or workshops, but I don't know that we necessarily do some of it in practice. And so I'd like to actually have more of a discussion on that next week when we talk about how to have some of this quote unquote multicultural competence. So just a quick